there it is. And there's Howard and oh,
Susan, I'm in the dark here. Hang on.
all right. Hi, Howard.
Hi, Susan.
It should be for you shortly. I will let him know. All right. Okay. All right. Oh, I see Michael Cole. There we are. So, and there you.
No, there I am.
Who's the Canadian pronunciation host? Oh,
That is my sister. There she is.
So,
Could you tell that she was Susan's sister?
now I can, yeah.
all of my
Cheekbones, cheekbones.
Yeah.
Yes, she wanted to hear it. So wasn't the rabbi's sermon today I just cried all the way through it. It was so wonderful.
Yeah.
Some hope, I must say.
Yeah.
Although
I'm waiting to hear about Rabbi Levi Yitzchak and from last night.
Yes.
Well, I did get back on.
Did you?
I should tell,
I
before
really,
anybody says anything else, can I just say one thing?
go ahead.
And that is that the recording function on these meetings is on, and everything we say
Oh,
gets recorded. Last time I opened the meeting like half an hour too early, and there's a half hour of chit chat between us that's been posted to the temple website.
Okay.
We better be careful what we say.
So nobody said anything scandalous, but if you were thinking of doing so, well, don't.
we should know now. Anyway, I must say, I thought the sermon today,
Yes.
the comments today were just, I don't know, they gave me some hope, which I think is so important. This notion of labor.
Oh, Larry Inkin is joining us. Good.
Ah,
Hi, Larry. Oh, got the anyway.
So you were saying, Sheila, that sermon will be online?
Well, I actually got on again last night, although I had to listen to a good part of the service again before I got to the sermon. But I did that, so I was able to hear all of the sermon and the remainder of the service last night.
I did the same thing, actually. I went to the 8:30 service.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
I went back to the 7:30. I don't know what I did, but anyway, it must have been the 8:30 service, but then it froze partway
Did
through.
it? Okay. No, I was
So-
able to get through to the end.
But I'm hoping that her sermon is somehow preserved and we can access it because it sounded very interesting.
Mhm.
You know what? I noticed that the Kol Nidre service is already up on YouTube.
The
So,
sermon.
you know, Holy Blossom has its own channel on YouTube, and you can actually hear all of the services that way again. And actually, in some cases, to be able to hear her sermons again has been so wonderful.
Yeah.
So-
And are we meeting tomorrow as usual?
Yes, I haven't sent out the link yet. I'll do that after sundown.
Are you serving breakfast? Because we'll all be hungry by then.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we'll start in about 5 minutes, people.
Great, great.
Larry, can you hear us? No.
Larry is muted, so maybe he's trying to say yes. I don't know.
There's,
You
hello.
have two points of entry.
Yeah. I've got
Hello,
two
Harriet.
screens going
Hello.
here.
Hi.
Hello.
I didn't realize
That's
she
a
was
lot.
on already.
Oh, Denise.
Who's coming? We have some of the choir people. That's great. Sandy?
Denise,
Hi,
hi. Shana
So you-
Tova to you.
Shana Tova. Let me see what I can do. Click if you want to switch to a different microphone. Okay, I'm trying to do. I'm toggled to my TV, so I'm trying to work this out.
Oh.
I think I'm a. Oh, by the way, are you interested in going to a dance performance?
Well, let's talk about that afterwards. There
Okay,
are
I'm just
700
letting you know.
cases today.
Okay, later.
Bob Cooper, Bob Cooper.
Yeah, hi, Bob.
Hello, Shana Tova.
Shana Tova, everyone.
Hello, Bob.
Shana Tova.
Actually, I owe you a phone call. I've been thinking I have to call you about something. So,
Okay.
yeah, what's your email?
B Cooper 4. BCOOPER, the number 4. At hotmail.com.
Bob, before you do that, this is being recorded. It's going to be posted online. So maybe, Michael, you can collect that email later.
Okay.
Oh, I think I've already said it.
Right,
But maybe lots of people want to email me about stuff.
I presume this recording is going out on Radio Canada International to the four corners of the earth.
Hello, Shana Tova.
Hi, Ruth is back. Good. Hi, Ruth. And Ruth is Ruth today. Yeah.
Renaming. Launch Zoom. Let's get out of here. Let's go here. Click Open Zoom meeting. Launch meeting.
Okay, a couple more minutes. We'll wait for a little more for people to join us if they want to.
Is there sound on?
Yeah, can you hear? No?
I can't hear anyone.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
That's because nobody was talking before.
We can hear each other, but of course you can't hear me even say that. Yeah. Let me, actually, no, it's you.
Yeah, it was me. My sound was turned off.
Okay.
Oops, because I have a different. I use this. There's a cable I use to watch the services on TV, so it mutes the sounds for some reason.
okay.
Okay, I'm going to mute everybody, I think, except you, Susan.
And
And
Michael.
I'll tell you to start, and then we'll go from there if that's okay.
Maybe we could start actually with Michael, and then Michael will hand it over to me.
All right. Well, okay, Michael, you start.
Okay. Rabbi Flood always used to ask, "Can you hear me?" before he started. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
If you can.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, I think the title of this little lecture is "The Great Organ Caper," which would sort of indicate that organs, like other aspects of our musical life at Holy Blossom, has always been somewhat controversial. Susan's going to tell you the story of the great organ caper, but organs, as I say, have always been a bit controversial. Some of you, when we're back in the sanctuary, will note if you haven't already, that if you look under the rose window to the back of the sanctuary, there's an organ console that is been unused for many years now, but once was the pride and joy of Holy Blossom Temple. Choirs. Some of you are in the choir, the temple, but choirs have always been a subject of controversy. Men and women in our choir?
Let's go to Aubrey.
Do we use the choir on high holy days or just on celebrations? And do we use it on Shabbat and so on? Cantors have been a subject of controversy. Do we need a cantor? Has been a question that we've sometimes asked. Interestingly, our first paid staff person, way back in the 1800s, the first staff person was not a rabbi, but a balkore, someone who could chant the Torah. He also had to be a Baal Tefillah who could lead prayers. He also had to be a teacher. He also had to be a moyel and a shochet. I don't think we've had that combination recently in our paid staff, but we once did. Many years ago, though, in the 1930s, as Susan will tell you, we didn't have a cantor at all because that was not part of our identity. But then later on it is, and we can hardly imagine life at Holy Blossom without a cantor today. So all of these musical controversies Susan is going to enlighten us about and entertain us with some musical examples. Susan.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And can I just say that this lecture was originally recorded as part of a series of 6 lectures that were given online over the summer by all of my colleagues on the Archives Committee. So you can see Michael and Sheila and Howard and the others. And really what we did is through personalities and stories, track the history of reform and its progress at Holy Blossom.
That's something over here.
So I'm going to actually just say that I was so struck today when the rabbi actually talked to the young woman who chanted Haftorah and talked about the fact that artists are getting us through this. It's not just science that will get us through the COVID epidemic, but artists are as well. And I think this is a synagogue that has always understood the arts, music and visual art as a way to worship as well. So that's the basis on which I created the lecture. And I'm going to turn it over to Howard, who is actually going to give us the opportunity to hear the recording. It'll be about an hour long, and after that we can ask some questions. If you have some questions in between, just use the chat function and we can get to them after the recording is over. Howard?
Okay, here we go.
We're going to follow the organ, and we're going to come at it from my point of view, which is the point of view of someone who had a socialist and somewhat Yiddish-centric background. And I found a route into religious Judaism through temple singers a long time ago. And I returned to the synagogue just a few years ago, after decades away. So I actually don't have a long experience in reform, and I'm counting on a lot of you to help me through this. But I especially want to say thank you to the Archives Committee, who have been so generous with their time and their information and asked and answered every stupid question that I could ask. So thank you to them. So I want to see how the congregation used music and some architecture to develop our Reform identity. And we're going to do it through the prism of the organ, where it is, how important it is, and the kinds of reactions it engendered. And we're going to listen to music as well as talk about 3 periods. That's our founding period, our Orthodox beginnings. And then, of course, the classical Reform period, what we call the era of the Word. And then finally, the era of the cantors. And then we're going to ask a question. I think, as Katie said, we're hoping that you will all mute yourselves because we'll do the best we can with the music. It might be a little wonky at times, but I think you'll be able to hear things pretty clearly. Our cantors didn't leave essays or books. Their imprint is very different. But still, I think the archives are a real treasure trove to construct the history of our Reform identity. Next slide. Thanks, Katie. So you all know that we started as an Orthodox synagogue. That's us on the top right, above a drugstore in rented quarters, you know, very walkable from where people lived and worked in 1856 on or near Lower Yonge Street. The religious employees at the time filled multiple roles. So they were shochet, melamed, moyo, and hazan, often all at the same time. The congregation actually got its first purpose-built building 1 block east of this drugstore in 1876. And that was actually before it got its first professional cantor. The building cost about $6,000, and many Christians who donated attended the opening. Businessmen, and they were well-off businessmen like Louis Samuel and Alfred Benjamin, were really well regarded in the city as philanthropists. I think this new building expresses some real confidence about their place in Toronto. And it was designed by a really prominent architectural firm of the time, Stewart and Strickland. By the way, these 2 drawings, the one on the left and bottom right, are actually from architecture books of the time.
Other study sessions are up, but not his.
A landmark building. So I actually find the building a little unprepossessing, but it is very upfront about its Jewish identity. And you can see in the sketch on the bottom right there, the Jewish star in the window, and then the Jewish star at the building's apex. So inside, typical of Orthodoxy, there's a woman's balcony. The reading of the Torah takes place at the center podium. But in a departure that sounds oddly familiar, the sanctuary didn't face east, it actually faced south. And nobody seems to have said anything about it. Next slide. So the building's opening, the dedication, was in 1876, and it was covered in all of the newspapers. They formed a choir, and they rented an organ just for the occasion. It was still Orthodox, but they actually assembled a woman's choir. So these were probably musically talented wives and daughters of congregants. It was covered, as I said, extensively in the press, but I want to draw you to the Toronto Mail and Empire because their article, I think, was the longest, the most detailed, and very respectful. And it said the music was actually learned by ear and was very creditable. The Mail also noted that neither women's voices nor the organ were actually allowed in Jewish services, but because this was not actually a service, it was acceptable. So the women's choir actually became a more regular fixture at Shabbats. And it was founded and led by Mrs. Rebecca Morris. That's the woman in the center photo. And then by Mrs. B. Hirschberg. That's the woman at the left. They were still unaccompanied by instruments. They sang from the women's balcony, but they were rehearsed and led by the first cantor, Joseph Gluck, and then from 1883 by cantor Herman Phillips. The women's choir had very good musicians, I think. I know it had musical capacity. And Zipporah Walters, who's the woman on the right, was actually noted for doing occasional public concerts. Obviously, if we're hearing women's voices in services, it's already placing Holy Blossom outside the confines of strict orthodoxy. Next slide. Oops. There we go. Oh. Back to slide 5, Katie. Thanks. Oops. Okay. Our first real cantor is Reverend Phillips. That's what they called him at the time. He was a cantor. He was a man with serious musical chops. He was actually a student of Louis Lewandowski, one of the great Jewish composers of 4-part choral settings for the synagogue. And Cantor Phillips had been in New York at Shaarei Tefillah, which is an Orthodox synagogue in that city. The English-trained rabbi there, Samuel Meyer Isaacs, had actually consulted with Holy Blossom on numerous occasions. There's actually a description of Cantor Phillips from 1865. That's the last year of the Civil War, the American Civil War. So he'd been in New York for a very long time. The Jewish Monthly, the Occident, and the American Jewish Advocate actually wrote, he has a rich baritone voice. He is aided by a well-trained choir of men and boys, and he conducted the worship with dignity and apparent devotion, and we thought him the proper man in the right place. I love the language. He joined Holy Blossom in 1883, and he was formal, he was orthodox, he deferred to the English establishment of the time, and he was not just Hazan, but he was also rabbi. He was really the spiritual leader of the congregation. His sermons were in English, and I actually found a quote from one in 1885 praising the volunteer militia who had returned from putting down the Riel Rebellion. He lauded the volunteers, quote, for their prompt service at the call of duty and for the blood shed in the cause of law and order. You can see in the quote on the left that he really brought decorum to Holy Blossom. They were very proud of this. They described it as the most orderly and well-kept shul in the Dominion. And I imagine that he sang some of his mentors' songs, the songs of Louis Lewandowski. So maybe this one. Katie? Great. So I think you can really hear the a cappella nature of that version. It's sung man and woman, so as it would have been heard at the time. And I think you can really hear the elegance and the decorum in that piece. So I think the congregation would have been very pleased with that rendition. Cantor Phillips, why did he come to Toronto, which was maybe, I don't know, less than 1,000 Jews, maybe 600 or so at the time? I actually suspect that it was actually because of the change at Shaarei Tefillah, because Shaarei Tefillah had actually introduced a mixed choir and an organ. in 1875, and I think he was lured here by the orthodoxy of Holy Blossom. He wasn't averse to women's voices in their place. He rehearsed the women's choir, but they still sang from the balcony. There was no organ at his services. And then in 1890, Holy Blossom made the fateful decision to include a small pump organ at Pesach, what our correspondent on the right breathlessly called the holy blossoms of a true and genuine reform. And Cantor Phillips gave notice immediately, and that quote doesn't refer to this at all. So next slide. I think the organ probably looked something like this. These were room organs, and we know it was played by a Gentile woman organist. You can imagine the consternation of tradition-minded congregants. And either before or shortly after Pesach, a group of congregants who were not happy about the organ snuck into the synagogue. They picked up the offending instrument and they carried it outside, or in some accounts, threw it out the window. And the board demanded that they return it. They did, but clearly it was too much for some, and they left to join Gold Tzedek. By the way, the dissidents were led by Jacob Draymond. He was the great-grandfather of our congregant today, Murray Hart. According to Stephen Speisman, the historian, the arguments over the organ continued for 2 years, and they were all along ethnic lines. The East Europeans were totally opposed to it. The Germans wanted the organ all the time, and the British, in that very British way, said, oh yes, fine, sometimes, not all the time. So the rabbi came to a conclusion that it could be used, but not on Yom Kippur. And again, the musical standards of the singers must have been quite high. One of the young sopranos in the choir at the time, a young woman named Adele Strauss, had actually been a professional singer in an opera company in New York. And the opera company was actually formed by Oscar Hammerstein's father. She came back to Toronto in the 1890s, appeared occasionally with the Toronto Symphony, and was remarked on as a very fine singer. And so music was definitely part of nudging the congregation, and of course, especially the younger members, to reform. Next slide. This is Cantor Solomon. In 1891, the congregation had taken a big step forward already, and we know that in the quote on the left, the organ was being used, the prayers were in English. I just wanted to read out the jab at the Orthodox on the quote on the left. Evidently, the sermons, which were in English, doubled the attendance on Saturday. And someone says, a select few who, in spite of having their places of business open on Sabbath, sail under the Orthodox flag. They keep aloof from the synagogue, the melodious strains of the organ being too much for their pious nerves. Cantor Solomon actually joined us in 1894. And again, this is somebody with really serious musical credentials. He had been cantor at the Rue de Nazareth Synagogue in Paris. That was the home synagogue of Samuel Naumburg, who was another of the great liturgical composers of the time. I think this picture of Cantor Solomon is just, I love it. I mean, he just seems like such a performer. He's got the cigarette in one hand. He's got his top hat, the sheared coat. He's great. And according to the quote on the right, he had an excellent baritone, was extremely well-trained, and thoroughly musical. And once again, they loved the decorum of the services. So Cantor Solomon stayed until 1901. We know he was actually a candidate for the Plum Street Reform Temple cantorial job. He was actually hired in San Francisco. He didn't get the job in Plum Street. And in 1894, the year that he was hired was also the year that Alfred Benjamin asked for male voices to be included in the choir. This took, of course, another year of debate. It's constant back and forth between tradition and reform. And in their very first appearance after that year of debate, men and women did sing together from the balcony. At their next appearance, however, and for some time afterward, the women actually stayed in the balcony and the men sang below. So you can imagine the sound was probably not the best. This is a selection from Samuel Naumburg's synagogue in Paris, the Rue de Nazareth Synagogue. It's one of his pieces, and it's sung in 1938 by the choir of the actual synagogue. And I've chosen it because it's a mixed choir, but the stars are the male voices. So, Katie. I think you have some idea of the grandeur of the music that would have been heard in the Richmond Street Synagogue, and really how gorgeous, really quite awesome, I think. The next slide. This is Bond Street, our next building. It's 1897, 115 Bond Street. And Alfred Benjamin and his brother had actually kicked off a campaign for this building with $10,000 of their own in 1893. So they were clearly very well-off businessmen. The location was very deliberate. The expanding Jewish community was moving north and west into St. John's Ward, so up University and towards Spadina. Holy Blossom actually moved even further east to Bond Street near Dundas, and the address was very deliberate because this was an area which was called the Street of Churches. So they were near Metropolitan Methodist Church. It's now Metropolitan United, that's on Queen Street. St. Michael's Cathedral, which is the Catholic Basilica in Dundas, and the Bond Street Lutheran congregation, also on Bond Street. And Holy Blossom would be added to the Street of Churches. A lot of prominent Torontonians contributed to the building. That was Timothy Eaton, Robert Simpson, the Masseys, even Sir Henry Pellet of Casa Loma fame. And Alfred Benjamin was clearly very confident. If he could ask these people, he was very confident in his relationship to the dominant culture in Toronto. There was a young up-and-comer architect, John Wilson Siddall, who won a very small competition. And the synagogue actually sent him to New York on an expense account of $50 to seek inspiration from the grand synagogues there. You can see on the left bottom, that central synagogue, which was actually built in 1872. And I know that through Cantor Phillips, of course, they would have known about the new synagogue in Berlin. That's the synagogue on the upper right, which was actually the synagogue of Louis Lewandowski. And you can see the similarities, the beautiful onion domes and the two towers on the side, lovely Romanesque arches. There's a certain pattern to these synagogues. But it is, I think, very assertive about its distinctiveness, its Jewish character. And this time, I have to say, I think this is a very impressive building. You can see the space inside. This picture at the bottom is actually after it was taken over by a Greek Orthodox church, but it gives you some idea of the dimensions and the beauty and the dome, all of those kinds of things. Next slide. So, oops, there we are. So this is our sanctuary inside in 1897. Cantor Solomon and Rabbi Lazarus both presided over the grand opening ceremony. And it was covered again by all the newspapers. The building cost $40,000 and sat 400 people. And the 4 scrolls were carried in at the opening. A young girl, just 8 years old, dressed in snowy white, walked slowly up the aisle to the president and offered him the key to the building on a silken cushion. The basement was up to date. There were offices and movable partitions that could make 8 classrooms. And inside you can see an octagonal domed central prayer hall with the ark, this time definitely on the eastern wall. And the rabbi's pulpit was near the ark. The cantor stand, however, allowed him to chant facing the ark, not the congregation, because that would have been just too reform for the time. And there was one glaring feature, I think you can see it, in the second balcony, in the balcony above the women's balcony, you can see a permanent pipe organ. And you can see the choir stalls, and you can also see the organist's place. So this is where a mixed choir actually sang from. The organ, by the way, was played by the same Gentile organist as from 1890, and I am happy to say we have found a picture of her. Emma Yeomans, the woman in the center there. This is a picture from 1906. She actually remained her organist for a very long time, and it's in her obituary. The mixed choir, as I said, now sang together from the choir stalls. There was no objection to it. And after Cantor Solomon left in 1901, Edmund Scheuer's brother, Benno, actually led the choir for several decades with Emma Yeomans as our organist. By the way, although I think this is beautiful, I have to tell you that this synagogue was eclipsed just 10 years later by the new Gold Tzedek on University, and it held 1,200 people, cost $65,000, took 3 years for the architect to design, and was built, so they said, along the lines of the cathedral at Westminster. And in one article, it said the scale and design were actually meant to prevent any drift of members to Holy Blossom. The dedication ceremonies were covered in the press. There was a 14-voice choir, 14 scrolls in procession. And when the guest rabbi uttered the words, God said, let there be light, 500 electric lights flashed. So it would have been quite the spectacle. Next slide. Nope, there we are. So nobody replaced Cantor Solomon, and it was attributed to cost. But it also, I think, coincided with generational and demographic change and increased leaning towards reform practices. And change had well and truly begun. A Gentile woman organist, a mixed choir of men and women, and in 1903, approval for using the organ at Yom Kippur. And our reform identity dates, I would say, officially from 1920, when we actually hired Rabbi Barnett Brickner, whom Katie has described so vividly. You will all know reform features, I think, much better than I do, but after a bit of reading, I would say that predictability and decorum were very important. Reform had also made many changes that we see: the organ, reading, not chanting the service, much more English, and much more elevated English, like, you know, a beautiful Anglican service, just stunning English, and shorter services, of course, not so much repetition. Choirs were prominent at the time. They were professional level choirs with excellent singers, but not necessarily cantors. And in 1897, the same year that Bond Street opened, the Reform movement actually produced the first hymnal. It was, I think, meant to encourage standards and standardization. It had English translations of Hebrew, adaptations of Protestant hymns. There were European classical music settings, Mendelssohn, Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart. The later editions did encourage more Hebrew and more consciously Jewish sound. But I think this was very much the style of the time. And we actually have a number of those very early hymnals in our archives, though we can't say exactly how they were used here. I think, though, that under Brickner, Isserman, and Eisendrath, and with the use, obviously, of the Union Prayer Book, we can expect these Reform musical features in our synagogue. Less Hebrew, much more English, much more formality, and more use of the organ. There's an organ prelude at the beginning of services, and then there's an organ postlude at the end. And of course, a much greater importance given to the sermon. So what represents this era? I believe that Reform would absolutely be typified by this song, which all of us know so well. Katie? So you can hear, that sounds very Protestant to me. I love to sing it. The English language is very lofty. I don't think there's a Jewish chord or Jewish harmony in it. It sounds Protestant. And until a very few years ago, Holy Blossom sang this, I think, to end the Yom Kippur afternoon martyrology service, I believe. Next slide. So there's a lot happening in Toronto at this time, and I just want to kind of set the stage a bit here. First of all, in 1901, there were 3,000 Jews in Toronto, and by 1920, more than 30,000. Most of them were East European, they were Yiddish speaking, they were poor, they were very insular, and English Jews were very definitely the minority. Toronto had begun its slow change from a staunch bastion of the British Empire. The Jews who came really changed the musical culture of this city. They were so attentive to music, they loved it. They loved string instruments. They put whatever money they had into lessons for their children. They took lessons at the local settlement houses. And many were from cantorial families who passed the art down through generations. For the next 40 to 50 years, it was not uncommon to find enterprising Hazanim, like entrepreneurial Hazanim, holding high holiday services in hotels in Toronto. Some Jews couldn't afford, or maybe didn't want memberships in synagogue, but they still identified very strongly with Jewish culture and values. The Landsmannschaft, and those were the location-based Jewish groups, were a big deal in Toronto. We still have synagogues that represent those Landsmannschaft, and Beth Radham is an example. A lot of the small groups obviously didn't have funds for full-time cantors, so there was a roving cantor who could be employed by several congregations. That was not uncommon. And I just wanted on this slide to show you a few of the musical families who changed Toronto's musical culture. I realize now you can't see the writing in the top right. That's actually the family of the Hamburgs. They were a family of world famous Russian musicians. They were nominally Jewish. They founded the Hamburg Conservatory, and that actually rivaled the Toronto Conservatory in its time. They had world famous artistic friends who came here to teach. And they actually had people like Pavlova, the great dancer, in their parties, and they were pretty amazing people. On the left, you can see the family of cantor Abraham Barkin, a great cantor and teacher from Russia. His son Leo was the major professional accompanist in Canada. Sarah, his daughter, was actually our lead soprano at Holy Blossom from 1943 to 1978. And her brother Jacob was an extraordinary cantor. The bottom left are the Glicks. That's Hazan David Glick, the father, an itinerant cantor who actually made a living from a jewelry store. And his son, you'll know the name, Cyril Glick, who was a CBC music producer, but really was one of the finest Canadian, not just Jewish, one of the finest Canadian composers of our time. And the Stolnitzes, that I don't think you can see it too well, but the one on the right is cantor Sam Stolnitz. He was the son of a very famous cantor named Nathan Stolnitz. And cantor Stolnitz, the senior, was a writer as well as a cantor. He actually wrote a book of Jewish song, and that book actually is half in Yiddish and half in English. The son was considered a boy wonder of that. Evidently was one of these roving cantors, and at the age of about 13 or 15 was actually cantor for a number of synagogues. He actually became our cantor when the cantorate was restored in the 1940s. The Stolnitzes were actually great cantorial performers in many cities in the 30s and 40s. And you can actually see them advertised in Jewish newspapers in places like Detroit, and you can see them advertised in other cities. So many Jewish musicians either came to Canada or they were born here during this time. Isaac Mamet, he was the principal cellist of the Toronto Symphony and the CBC Symphony. Ben Steinberg, who is the son of a cantor from Winnipeg and probably one of the most important Reform composers. Violinist Maurice Solway. I think you will know him for his solos in the movie The Red Violin. Conductor Victor Feldbrill, who championed Canadian music. Composer and Ontario Arts Council Director Lou Applebaum. Emile Gardner, who was the longest serving and best conductor of the secular Toronto Jewish Folk Choir, founded in 1929, and by the way, led Temple Singers for a while. You can say the Jews actually really populated the TS string section, the clubs, the CBC Symphony string section. They taught at the Symphony, they taught at the Conservatory, they taught at the settlement houses. Next slide. I want to mention radio because it had such a big impact. It made celebrities of people and even institutions, and Holy Blossom and its clergy understood the power of the medium. Rabbi Eisendrath had a weekly program called Form of the Air on Sunday afternoons for several years after he came to Toronto. And Rabbi Feinberg, you can see Rabbi Feinberg in a beautiful picture as Anthony Frome, poet prince of the NBC airwaves. He actually, I think, brought really performative power to his rabbinate. He may have rejected radio and theater as a profession, but he had his own weekly radio program here in Toronto for a while. He made himself available as a popular interview subject, as well as a guest on CBC. For example, he was quite popular on CBC's national debate show, which was also a quiz program called Fighting Words. And CBC, by the way, wasn't the only player. There were also a lot of privately owned independent stations. And the local Yiddish paper called Der Kanader Nayas, the Canadian News, sponsored its own radio show, The Jewish Hour. That, by the way, is a publicity photo from The Jewish Hour. It went on from the 1930s, late 30s into the early 40s. Guess who the performers were? Nathan Stolnitz, Sam Stolnitz, all the Barkins, Hazan David Glick, and so many more. And there were even rival Jewish hours 3 of them, one following the other on Sunday afternoons. Next slide. So the movies. Canada actually had one of the biggest movie distribution networks anywhere. And it was huge, and it was very much a Jewish development. For some 15 years, Jewel and Jay Allen, those are the American brothers, controlled the biggest movie theater chain in Canada. They came here in 1906. They built a theatorium, that's what they called it, a theatorium in Brantford. And then they expanded across the country to almost 100 theaters. And I have to tell you that even in a small town, those theaters had 1,500 seats. That's how popular the movies were. There were actually 4 Allen theaters in Toronto, including the one you can see, that lovely, elaborate one in the top called the Tivoli. And I've included the one on the bottom because that is actually the Allen Theater on the Danforth, which is now the Music Hall. The Allens actually had the franchise on the Mary Pickford movies. She was the first genuine Canadian superstar. She was a genuine superstar, and she was actually Canadian. The Pickford movies were controlled actually by Adolf Zucker in Hollywood. And in 1923, he drove the Allens out of the business by actually canceling their franchise for her movies. The Allens then picked themselves up and eventually became part of Famous Players, which was actually controlled by Nate Nathanson. And he was another American immigrant, a former newsboy from Minneapolis. He eventually partnered with Adolf Zucker as the owner of Famous Players. And when he retired in 1941 from Famous Players, he actually joined his son in the Odeon movie theater chain. And then the famous Arthur Cohen, no relation. He was a lawyer, the son of Jacob Cohen, the first Jewish magistrate of Toronto. Cohen joined Famous Players, worked his way up, and eventually retired in 1933 at the height of the Depression, and he stayed very heavily involved in Jewish philanthropy. Our next slide. So that we were able to build on Bathurst Street in 1938, the Depression was still ravaging Canada and Toronto, and it owes a lot to these movie people. In 1926, they had actually helped Holy Blossom wipe out a very heavy operating deficit and a mortgage, and it was the movie people who headed up the campaign for Bathurst Street in 1936. Nate Nathanson was the honorary chair of the campaign. He convened a dinner, and immediately by the end of the dinner, he had raised $65,000. The 3 official chairs of the fundraising campaign were Nate Nathanson, Jewel Allen, and Arthur Cohen. And the architects, Chapman and Oxley, were a very prominent firm, and they had designed the ROM among so many other buildings. The Holy Blossom, by the way, was considered one of their most important achievements. The booklet from 1938, the opening, claims the design has antecedents in Jewish archaeology. They claim that Chapman and Oxley researched this extensively, but I know that non-Holy Blossom Jews dismiss this as the church on the hill, and it does have a lot of the look of a church. It was very ambitious. It made use of the latest building materials. And you can see on the ad on the right that it was known for being the highest building of poured concrete at the time, really a symbol for modernity. The book makes just a passing reference to the fact that the Bathurst Street plot of land faces west. I don't think it was a defiant reform statement, the fact that the sanctuary faces west. What we do know is that Rabbi Eisendrath had actually sounded out a respected professor at HUC about this, and he had received advice that facing east was just minhag, or custom. So where's the organ? You're going to ask. Well, according to our histories, Katie, can you just point out the lattice work? There it is. So evidently behind there, that was actually called, not the lattice work, but called the choir screen. And behind there, there was a large organ as well as a choir room. So that's where everything, so you wouldn't see any of these people. There was no cantor's pulpit, as you can't see from this, but there was no cantor's pulpit. And that was added years later. Oh, and by the way, at the opening ceremonies, there were many rabbis, but there were no cantors in the opening ceremonies in front of Lord Tweedsmuir, the Governor General. And who was the organist? Well, this time we actually had our first Jewish organist. And this was a man named Eric Schaefer, the very first of a very small number of Jewish musical refugees who escaped here in 1938. And according to government records, Eric Schaefer actually came to be organist and choir director at the Jewish synagogue, Holy Blossom. I'm quoting from the government papers. The souvenir book expresses an awful lot of pride in this choir and in its skills. And we know that by the 1940s, the choir was a mix of Gentile and some Jewish singers, including, by the way, Sarah Barkin. We think as well Sam Stolnitz and some other people I'm going to tell you about. We have a record of the music played at that grand opening weekend, a program. And I looked through the music for the weekend. There were 3 different programs that weekend. There were only 3 Jewish composers during that whole time. And they were Sulzer, Lewandowski, and the opera composer Meyerbeer. There were a few traditional songs, and I mean 2 or 3 at most. And mostly it was organ music and choir music from Gounod, Brahms, César Franck, Liszt, Handel, Mozart, and Pachelbel. Next slide. So I think this was obviously the height of classical reform, and it didn't last long. In 1943, Rabbi Feinberg came, and he really did insist on the first cantor of this period, promoting Sam Stolnitz, who had been in the choir. He was a trained singer. Rabbi Feinberg reminded us of music's emotional power, and he introduced more music and more Hebrew into the services. And he came in 1943. In 1944, he founded Temple Singers. And among other performances, Rabbi Feinberg actually took them in an exchange with an African-Canadian Methodist church at the time. Rabbi Plout continued that move towards more traditionalism. We actually have a letter from 1970 in the archives from Naomi Bell to Rabbi Plout, wondering why young B'nai Mitzvah students weren't encouraged to chant rather than read Torah and Haftorah. And she even proposed setting up a class to learn Nusach from the cantor. It became increasingly more common to chant after that. Ben Steinberg, the great composer, that's him in the center. He's looking very happy because here in 1969, they actually had installed a new organ. He actually helped to organize the youth choir, then a religious school choir. And Ben Steinberg was also music director and choir director in Rabbi Plout's time. And I've got to say, he really invigorated the music programs. He played an accordion, which he nicknamed Oscar, in classes. He headed up Temple Singers. He composed music. He premiered 2 of his most important Shabbat service settings here. But he was really a Reform composer, and so he created pieces for the organ. Katie, could we do Ben Steinberg's organ prelude for Shabbat? I'm sure many of you remember that sound and the grandeur of those services. Also, though, Ben actually brought a lot of new instrumental soloists to Friday night, and the first of these was in 1964. violinist Maurice Solway, who was actually a congregant. Oh, by the way, Ben Steinberg also brought a dance company in 1965, and they actually weren't there just to do a concert. They actually took part in the Shabbat service on Saturday morning. And also he programmed jazz with Mo Kaufman and Paul Brody. And then in 1968, he and Cantor Barkin expanded the role of temple singers when they performed Franz Schubert's extended vocal setting of Miriam's Song of Triumph. Steinberg nurtured our own temple singers as soloists. Some of you, I'm sure, remember Helen Sherman because she actually took a lead role in this concert. And when you read the bulletins, Steinberg's imprint is just all over everything. Innovation, festivals, special programming, premieres. It must have been a huge draw for congregants and outsiders. And then, as you can see, the choir moved again. This was up into the balcony. And the person who came to, as part of that premiere weekend, was Max Janowski, who was famous for the choral setting of Avinu Malkeinu that we love so much here. I'm not sure how long Eric Schaefer stayed with us, but eventually we hired Doug Bodel, who was the conductor of a church. He brought a lot of excellent singers, but like him, they were pretty much all very churchy in style. Next. This is the era of the cantor. That started in 43 with Cantor Stolnitz. He was, we think, promoted from the choir to be cantor. You know he had the experience. I think he was pretty lost in the shadow of Rabbi Feinberg. So, but he did actually teach our own Michael Cole to play the shofar. So Cantor Stolnitz left to try for a career in Hollywood in the late 40s. And that's when Norman Summers started his career. That second after Cantor Stolnitz, so that one, thank you. He was actually a remarkable bass. He was a teenager at the time, and he became our cantorial soloist for 2 years. He left us actually for professional training at HUC Music School, and his career was incredibly illustrious. By the way, he returned to Canada, to Toronto, in 1962 as soloist for the Bloch Sacred Service with the Toronto Symphony, and Rabbi Plout as narrator. Katie, could we play a bit of Cantor Summers? Very kind of angular, very contemporary music, I think. It's Max Helfman again. Our next cantor, as the one on the just to the right, is Jacob Barkin. Cantor Barkin came here. You know, part of that eminent musical family. By the way, the only Holy Blossom cantor whose coming and going actually merited profiles in the Globe and Mail. He came in 1965 for our first Spring Arts Festival, and the Holy Blossom Bulletin announced it as, quote, the triumphant return of cantor Jacob Barkin. And it was actually around that time, and I really mean within about a month or so, that Sam Stolnitz very quietly announced his retirement. That concert included a 45-piece orchestra, an augmented choir of 80 voices. Benny would have killed for that. It was all under Steinberg's direction, and it was the Canadian premiere of Sholem Secunda's oratorio, if not higher. Secunda, actually, you know, wrote the music for By Mir Bist Du Shein. So he was the star composer of the Yiddish theater. Barkin, I have to tell you, was a very conservative religious person. He had actually been cantor at a very conservative synagogue in Washington, D.C. for 17 years. He performed for presidents, and he replaced Richard Tucker, the great opera singer, at Tucker's High Holiday services in the Catskills. He joined Holy Blossom in 1966. He stayed through 69. And Michael Cole told me that he actually made it a condition of his employment that he wear a kippah during services. So here is Cantor Barkin in Sim Shalom. Okay, so you can hear that East European chanting style that Barkin really brought to us. Our next cantor, by the way, is his cantor, Shelley Merrill. He came in 1969, and that's the same year, by the way, that Ben Steinberg left us. And I think Shelley Merrill was a wonderful cantor, but also he was a very innovative person, and he partnered with Beth Tikva to premiere Cyril Glick's Passover Suite. He also commissioned Milton Barnes' Dybbuk Suite and commissioned Toronto Dance Theatre to provide choreography and dancers in the synagogue for that opening. A little bit, perhaps, of Cantor Merrill.
והביקורים והוריו וגמילוש חסודים ושלמות תורה.
Honestly, I think all of them were just exceptional vocalists. And clearly really rooted in Jewish values. But it was our next cantor that I think, because of his 41 years here, has really, I think, brought teaching Jewish values through music. And he also came, Benny, from a conservative synagogue to be cantor and music director. I honestly thought when I started that no one could touch him, and I really do think his career has been extraordinary. But he clearly built on the things that had been the contributions of these musicians and vocalists and cantors from before. So he tirelessly brought us the best of Jewish music from around the world and the ages, just as Steinberg and Barkin had. He mentored generations of lay leaders, and as Feinberg and later Plaut did, he led, taught, and supported lay people as Shiva leaders and service leaders. He commissioned new work like Shelley Merrill, and he also brought dance into the synagogue. And if music once divided us from others in the Jewish community 100 years ago, Benny actually used music to connect us by reaching out to non-Jewish groups and to other Jewish denominations, including the Orthodox and the conservative, just as Cantor Merrill had. Cantor Merrill was considered an exemplar of that by the Toronto Council of Hazanim. He also, of course, hired our first woman cantor, that's the wonderful Lindy Rivers. And Feinberg's interfaith work with temple singers, I think, hints at Cantor Meisner's reconciliation work with Germany. Benny actually brought the Dresdener Kreuz Choir from Germany to sing Mendelssohn's Elijah at Holy Blossom in 1992, when every other Jewish venue in North America actually bowed out of their appearance. And he also made temple singers, I'm happy to say this, a very regular part of services. And there is so much to choose from in Benny's repertoire. I hope you will agree with me on this choice, because I think it typifies the warmth that he brought to the synagogue. So, next slide. I think this is possibly the most decisive moment. Organ actually broke down. And instead of repairing it, Cantor Meisner and Rabbi Moskowitz encouraged the synagogue to abandon the formal organ, take 200 seats out of the main sanctuary, and build the lower bima in 2005. And that brought the cantor, the rabbi, the professional choir, temple singers, and our musical instruments right into the midst of the congregation to better engage in worship. And it seems in its own way to be the most radical, the most traditional thing that we have done. And so where's the organ now? Well, the organ is there beside the lower bema, but it's a portable instrument, a digital piano. It mimics an organ and many other instruments. And it changed, I think, the nature of music in the sanctuary and the relationship of music to the congregation and the space. So next slide. I'm going to leave you with a question, and I think you guys are really well equipped to answer this, better even than I. Benny joked with us at our last Temple Singers party. He said, don't tell the congregation, but they are not really Reform. And so that's the question I leave for you, and maybe we'll talk about it next week. Are we different, and how?
Well, hang on, you're muted. Let me unmute you.
So that really is the conclusion of it. Really, first of all, any questions? Murray, I can see you're here. I'm so glad we mentioned you. Murray Hart. And Jill, that's great. And David. Oh, David Hart is here. Oh, how wonderful. Oh, there we are. Really one of the most important members of our archives committee, and really so glad to have you here. Are there any questions that any of you have, or any thoughts on whether we actually are still the kind of Reformed congregation that you see around North America?
Please unmute yourself if you want to speak. Who's trying to speak here?
Oh. Okay, well, in that case, oh, we see someone there, sorry. Yes?
Hi, Bonnie Lawrence Shear. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I've been a member for at least 75 years. And I don't know, I think we aren't as Reformed as we were. There have been huge changes since I was a little girl, especially with Rabbi Feinberg.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it all happened when my generation grew up and we married people outside of Holy Blossom who brought in much more conservative changes. And I mean, just the idea of kippah and a tallit, which weren't around when we were young. So yes, there have been changes. I think it's less Reform, at least less classical Reform. Whether it's better, I'm not sure, but I enjoy Holy Blossom, no matter how it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, can I actually say, it seems to me that those demographic changes were certainly part of that change in terms of the kind of music that we wanted to hear as well. And I know that lots of people married into other families, conservative families or Orthodox families, and came to here for a sound that was probably more traditional and more like the sound they had left behind. So, any other comments or? Michael, anything you want to end with?
Well, no, we've certainly had a very full overview of music at Holy Blossom through the ages, organs, choirs, and cantors. yeah, it's very different from, haven't been around quite as long as Bonnie, but pretty close. And I must say, one of the really moving experiences of my youth was when my parents took me to my first adult Kol Nidre service. And I pre-bar mitzvah, I must have been about 12 or so, and Rabbi Feinberg sang Kol Nidre himself. How many of you remember, any of you old enough to remember Rabbi Feinberg singing Kol Nidre? He had a wonderful voice, and he would sing Kol Nidre into the open ark. And that really began the service. So to take the Torah scrolls out of the ark, and then he would sing Kol Nidre into the ark. It was one of the more moving experiences of my youth, and I remember it fondly. But yes, I think you did a wonderful job, Susan.
Well, thanks.
I certainly learned a great deal that I didn't know about music at Holy Blossom, certainly in its early years and even beyond. So thank you for that.
Thank you. So I think that we're probably almost ready. Only a few more minutes. The services will start, I think, at 3:30. So we have about an hour. So I will leave you all to rest. And I hope with the sounds of Holy Blossom's music ringing in your ears. Shana Tova to you all. Thank you all for taking part and being here.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to the Archives Committee for bringing us so much amazing information and background.
Thanks, Susan. Marvelous.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
That was very informative. Oops.
I will end the meeting. Thank you, Susan. That was marvelous. Thank you, Michael. And we'll see you all again soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.